Lamborghini just posted the best year in its entire history, and it did that while quietly admitting the exact opposite of what it promised the world 4 years ago. Not a stumble, not a rough quarter, a record-breaking, champagne-popping, best numbers ever kind of year, delivered in the same breath as a confession that the electric future it swore was coming has been pushed past the end of this decade. Here's the number that explains why this matters. In 2025, Lamborghini delivered 10,747 cars and pulled in close to $3.7 billion in revenue, both records, both all-time highs for a brand that sells fewer cars in a full year than a mainstream automaker moves in a single week. And that milestone landed during a stretch when tariffs alone reportedly cost the global auto industry more than $35 billion, a backdrop that should have made this the year Lamborghini quietly underperformed and blamed the macro environment. Instead, it broke every internal record it has, and in that same reporting window, the car meant to prove Lamborghini could go fully electric got quietly walked back into something else entirely. This is the story of how the loudest electric promise in the supercar world turned into the industry's biggest tell, and why what Lamborghini just confirmed for 2026 should make you rethink everything you assumed about where this market is actually heading. To understand how strange this moment is, you need to understand what Lamborghini swore to the world back in 2021. That year, under its Direczione Cortori strategy, Lamborghini committed to electrifying its entire lineup by the middle of this decade, with a fully electric fourth model, codenamed the Lanzador, arriving as the brand's first ever EV. This wasn't a side project buried in a footnote of an annual report. This was Lamborghini standing on stage in front of the entire automotive press, declaring that the loudest, most gasoline-soaked brand on the planet was going to prove electrification and raw emotion weren't opposites. The Lanzador concept debuted to genuine excitement, and for good reason. It looked like nothing else in the lineup, a 2+2 electric Grand Tourer with a raised stance somewhere between a coupe and a crossover, built specifically to argue that 4 doors worth of practicality and 0 tailpipe emissions didn't have to mean giving up what makes a Lamborghini feel like a Lamborghini. Enthusiast press treated it as proof the brand was serious. This wasn't a compliance car, it was positioned as the future flagship of an entirely electrified range. Then reality showed up, and this is where the story actually starts to unravel. By February of this year, Lamborghini's own CEO, Stefan Winkelmann, was calling electric vehicle development an expensive hobby, and stating flatly that demand for that kind of product among Lamborghini's actual customer base was, in his words, close to zero. Think about what that sentence does. This isn't an analyst outside the company speculating about slowing EV demand from a spreadsheet. This is the man running the brand, on the record, telling the industry that the customers writing 7-figure checks for Lamborghinis simply are not asking for an electric one. Not now, maybe not for years. That is about as close as a CEO of a company this size ever gets to publicly admitting a flagship strategy misjudged its own audience. Here's the kicker. Winkelmann later tried to soften those comments, telling reporters they were, quote, a bit taken out of context. But the walkback only went so far. The actual confirmed timeline he gave for Lamborghini's first fully electric model is now, in his own words, for sure after 2030. Read that again. A company that once had a public electrification target for the middle of this decade just pushed its first EV to sometime in the next decade, with no fixed date attached to it at all. That is not a delay measured in months, that is an entire additional product cycle, the kind of timeline shift that would have been unthinkable to say out loud back when the Lanzador first rolled onto a stage under bright lights and applause. And the Lanzador itself, the car that was supposed to be proof this could work, didn't survive the reversal in its original form either. Instead of launching as Lamborghini's debut EV, the concept is now evolving into a plug-in hybrid, reportedly positioned positioned as a potential replacement direction for the Urus lineup rather than the fully electric halo car it was unveiled as. The car built to prove Lamborghini could go electric is, at least for now, not going electric. And yet, buried in the same earnings language, Lamborghini was careful to say the new hybrid direction reinforces what it called a long-term industrial vision focused on sustainable value creation without compromising the future development of a fully electric model. That is a company trying to have it both ways in public. Officially, the electric dream is still alive somewhere down the road. Practically every near-term product decision just moved further away from it.
So here's the question worth sitting with. How does a brand post record revenue and record deliveries in the exact same year it quietly shelves its own electric promise? The answer is almost uncomfortable in how simple it is. Lamborghini's customers never asked for the transition in the first place. The entire electrification push wasn't built from the ground up on customer demand. It was built to get ahead of regulatory pressure and industry momentum. The same pressure that pushed Porsche, another Volkswagen Group brand, into betting its own infrastructure on an aggressive EV timeline that blew out spectacularly in its face just months earlier, wiping out the majority of its automotive division's operating profit in a single year and forcing out its own CEO in the process. Lamborghini watched that happen in real time from inside the same parent company, sharing supply chains, sharing platform investment decisions, sharing the same corporate pressure to hit group-wide electrification targets, and adjusted course before it repeated the mistake at full scale. That is the part that should genuinely concern every other manufacturer watching this unfold. Two brands under the same parent company, both making aggressive public electrification promises within roughly the same window, and both now walking those promises back. One after a financial collapse serious enough to trigger thousands of job cuts and a full leadership change, and one before it even got there. Lamborghini didn't have to gut itself to learn this lesson. It got to watch its own sister brand do that first, absorb the damage, rebuild the strategy from scratch under a new CEO, and Lamborghini simply adjusted its own plan before the same mistake reached its balance sheet. Here's why this matters, even if you will never come close to affording a Lamborghini. This brand exists at the absolute top of the market, completely insulated from the pricing pressure, the fleet sales, and the lease-driven volume games that mainstream automakers depend on to hit their numbers. If any manufacturer on Earth could afford to force an unpopular technology onto its customer base and simply wait for demand to catch up, absorbing the development cost as a rounding error against billions in margin, it's the one selling seven-figure cars to buyers who don't finance them and don't cross-shop on a monthly payment. And even that brand just looked at the actual appetite for electric performance cars among its own customers and concluded the smarter move was to wait. That is not a company reacting to a slowdown out of financial necessity, the way Porsche was ultimately forced to. That is a company with more pricing power than almost anyone in this industry, choosing patience over ideology. And that distinction should worry every executive who bet their volume brand's entire strategy on a hard EV deadline set years in advance of knowing whether the customer would actually show up. Now here's where it gets interesting, because instead of retreating into caution, Lamborghini is doing the opposite. It's leaning harder into what actually generated the record year in the first place. The company has confirmed 4 new models arriving across 2026, each one a derivative of the current 3-model lineup, rather than an entirely new nameplate, rolled out at some of the most prestigious automotive events on the calendar. The first lands in May at a dedicated event in Imola. The second debuts at the Goodwood Festival of Speed in July. The third arrives at the Pebble Beach Concours in August, reportedly including a more exclusive, limited-run creation in the spirit of last year's Phenomeno, the kind of ultra-limited, no-expense-spared special that exists purely to remind the market what the brand is capable of when margin isn't the primary constraint.
And the fourth caps the year at Art Basel in Miami in December, a venue choice that says as much about who Lamborghini thinks its buyer is as any spec sheet could. Read between the lines on what that rollout actually represents. Lamborghini isn't chasing headline-grabbing new technology to stay relevant. It's squeezing every possible variant, every open-top version, every performance-focused trim out of the platforms it already has. The same playbook that produced cars like the Huracan Starato, the Aventador SVJ, and the Urus Performante in prior cycles, each of which sold to buyers who already had a Lamborghini and simply wanted a sharper, more specialized version of it. Reports point towards likely candidates, including open-top versions of the current Temerario and Revuelto, meaning Lamborghini's big 2026 news cycle may largely consist of removing roofs from cars it already builds and charging accordingly. That is not the strategy of a company scrambling to catch up to a shifting market. That is the strategy of a company that just had its best year ever, doubling down on exactly what got it there, betting that variety within a proven formula outperforms a risky leap into something unproven.
And it's not stopping at road cars. Lamborghini's Squadra Corse racing division has confirmed it is pausing its SC63 prototype, the effort competing at the top level of endurance racing in both the United States and Europe for the entire 2026 season. The brand is explicitly refocusing that investment toward its GT3 platform and Super Trofeo series instead, betting on the categories where more of its actual production-adjacent cars compete, rather than the prototype program that demanded the heaviest technological investment with the least direct connection back to what customers can actually buy. Lamborghini had been the only manufacturer building its LMDH prototype around a Ligier chassis, while every other brand entering that category in the same window chose to partner with Oreca or Dallara instead, the more established suppliers already serving multiple manufacturers. Even Lamborghini's former factory partner in that program, Iron Lynx, has since moved on to run Mercedes-AMG's factory GT3 effort. Even in motorsport, the pattern holds. Redirect the resources toward what's already working. Pull back from the expensive, forward-looking bet that isn't paying off on the timeline anyone hoped for, and reallocate that budget toward the categories directly tied to the cars sitting in dealer showrooms right now. So where does this actually leave the rest of the market? Every manufacturer that spent the last 5 years treating an aggressive EV timeline as an unquestionable inevitability now has to sit with an uncomfortable data point. The brand with arguably the most devoted, least price-sensitive customer base in the entire industry looked directly at electric demand from its own buyers and concluded the honest answer was not yet, and possibly not for years. That is not a company that failed to execute the way Porsche did, burning through billions and its own CEO in the process. That is a company that watched the execution risk play out next door, inside its own parent group, and chose to wait rather than repeat it at its own scale. This is the part every BMW, every Ferrari, every Mercedes-AMG executive should be sitting with right now in private. If Lamborghini, sitting on record revenue, record deliveries, and a customer base that could absorb almost any price premium without blinking, still concluded the demand simply isn't there yet, what does that say about the manufacturers building electric vehicles for buyers who actually do care about the price tag on the window sticker? The luxury end of this market just handed everyone else a preview of what happens when you let actual customer behavior instead of regulatory pressure and industry momentum decide the timeline. And Winkleman himself left the door only partially closed, saying Lamborghini would, quote, follow very closely the rate of acceptance of electric cars in the future for its type of customer, and that the company would never say never on going fully electric eventually. That is not a company burning the bridge. That is a company standing on the near side of it, waiting to see if anyone actually needs to cross. So here's where this lands. Lamborghini didn't blow up because a strategy failed publicly and expensively the way it did at Porsche. It blew up the assumption everyone else in the industry was quietly building their entire roadmap around. The assumption that electrification was simply inevitable on a fixed schedule, regardless of what customers actually wanted. Record numbers, a shelved EV target pushed past 2030, a hybrid stand-in where the electric flagship used to be, a racing program pulled back to protect the budget lines that actually matter, and 4 gasoline and hybrid-powered derivatives rolling out across the most prestigious stages in the automotive calendar. That is not a company retreating. That is a company that ran the experiment, watched a sister brand suffer the consequences of moving too fast, and chose to let its own record-breaking year do the talking instead. Now I want to hear from you. Do you think Lamborghini is making the smart, patient call here? Or do you think this is just delaying an inevitable transition it will eventually be forced into anyway? Drop your take in the comments because some of the best breakdowns on this channel start with what you bring to the conversation. And if this kind of deep numbers-first analysis is what you actually want from a car channel instead of surface-level hype, make sure you're subscribed because this is exactly the research most channels won't do for you.